Hello, my name is Bill Edgett. Tonight I'm going to have Glenn Cheriton, the president of the CEPC, on with us to discuss issues concerning many parents. Now, Glenn Cheriton has been an advocate for shared parenting and trying to get shared legislation created in Canada for a number of years. And currently he is the president of the CEPC. I'm a board member. We have monthly meetings and we try to get members across the country to join up with us, just individuals like myself who are advocating for shared parenting to join up with our group and try to help connect with our local politicians, MPs, MLAs, share information about the benefits of shared parenting, how it will benefit families instead of having families continue to be divided by the adversarial system, which the family court system is set up to be. Instead of stepping in and trying to help keep a good relationship between both parents with the children through this breakup situation, most times they create more anxiety and trouble for the children by putting them with one parent over another when they've been used or accustomed to having full access to each parent. This is just one of the situations that needs to be addressed. And shared parenting, I believe, would be a good start in the right direction to help alleviate the problems with a lot of these situations. I am just waiting for Glenn to join me, so I'll just keep talking for a little bit. Next week, I hope to have Martin Berenson on with me. Martin Berenson is a father from Peru who is currently in a battle to try and have his son returned to him in Peru. The mother had left Peru and went to Canada and has been granted custody of the child, even though they had a joint shared parenting custody order in Peru. So she left the country with the son, and the latest decision by a judge was that they were going to leave the child in the custody of the mother because they had taken so long to handle or deal with this situation in this case. So instead of handling the situation properly, making real decisions based on the evidence, the judge basically said, well, this is the status quo that's been created, and we're just going to continue with that. That's the problem with a lot of these cases. Give me a sec. Hello, Glenn. No, it was in Messenger. Yes, it was in your Messenger on your Facebook, and if you just click that. So yeah, if you just yeah, I could have sent it to your email. Sorry about that. Um, mhm. Excellent. So if you click on, take you right there, and yep. All right, I'll add you in just a minute. All right, bye. Okay, that was Glenn. He was just calling because he was looking for the link to this podcast in his email, and I had sent it to his messenger. So he said he was just logging in there, and I'll add him as soon as he comes up. And back to Martin Berenson, his case, this has been going on for a number of years, and I'm looking forward to talking to him next week and letting him share everything he's gone through to try and get his case recognized and get some help with what he's been through and what his family's been through throughout this process. It's horrible that it was delayed so long in Canada, and it was just put off and not dealt with. And because of that, that's the reason they're using to not address or deal with the situation. Anyway, I've got Glenn, and I'll bring him right on here now. All right. How you doing, Glenn?
I'm doing fine.
Yeah, we got you here now. That's good. So tonight I have Glenn Cheriton. He's the president of the CEPC and an advocate for shared parenting. So Glenn's been advocating for that for a number of years, and that's how him and I met up. And I also am an advocate for shared parenting. I believe that will be a good start to trying to make the situations of high conflict divorce better. Instead of just dealing with cases tonight or parental alienation, Glenn's come on because he has another issue he'd like to share with people to try to bring people together to work around to get a solution. Tonight, you came on to talk about the National Citizens Inquiry. So, what is the National Citizens Inquiry, Glenn?
Well, this is an interesting initiative by Preston Manning, and I knew him growing up in Alberta, and listened to his father, who was premier of the province at that time. But what he's done now is that he started this idea of doing a citizens inquiry. Like usually, if you're looking at an issue, government would lead an inquiry, but this is something that he started as a citizens initiative, where it's a nonprofit organization that will look into what the government did during the shutdown and the pandemic. So it's not looking at the effects of the pandemic itself; it's looking at what government did and the resulting harms or benefits to people for government action. So
Okay.
that's he's setting it up, and what we're looking for is to ask people to go to the site that he's got there, National Citizens Inquiry.ca, I believe it is, and
Yes.
he's asking that people put their name down and say this is a good idea if you think it's a good idea. So my basic approach is to encourage people to support what he's doing. It's being done outside of government, so it doesn't have the authority to subpoena or force people to testify. But we're looking for ordinary citizens to support this, and perhaps if your life has been harmed or affected by what government has done in the shutdown, then we're asking that you actually participate in the inquiry as well.
Okay. So yeah, that's a good point. Like why should parents make those inputs into the inquiry? It's what's your thoughts on that?
Well, this is something that I've mentioned to a number of people, and their first reaction was, well, why parents? And I said, well, one of the things that government did right at the beginning was to shut down family courts. And immediately people say, well, that's right. All across the country, making it much more difficult for parents to see their kids, to resolve family law issues. So with the courts closed, it just makes things a lot more difficult for parents. So that is one thing. And then the other thing, of course, a lot of parents had their work shut down. So this is an impact on parents. So parents were at home, or the difficulty that people have in traveling. So if your child, if you're separated and divorced and your child is in a different province, then you would have enormous difficulties in traveling to see your child. So there's that effect as well. You get situations where the schools were shut down, so you would have to be home teaching your child, or if you couldn't see your child or work out an arrangements, then who knows how your child, it may be out of school but not being taught. So all of these things are effects on parents that are particularly difficult. So parents, when they start thinking about these things, say, yes, there's all these effects, and they are negative. There are things done by government. So thank goodness for Preston Manning and his initiative to say, here's a forum where you can come and say, this is how government action affected my life.
Okay, I like that, and that's you're right. When COVID first started, one of the first reports I remember seeing surrounding parental alienation was children being kept from one party um, in contravention of a court order, and not much was really being done about it because the police and RCMP, their line is that we do not criminalize civil matters. Now, any court order that's not followed, that is a criminal offense according to the Criminal Code of Canada. So, how would people like this is a one of the issues I'd love to see that the government deal with, and how to uh, facilitate uh, these situations to get them resolved quicker by having the police do something and give them the ability to do something instead of just saying go away and make your applications to the court, go there in a couple of years, and then get a solution then, which doesn't help 2 years away. So, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, certainly talking to a lot of parents, the government inaction on these matters is not neutral to both sides. So typically, what you find is that if one parent is particularly difficult and blocking the relationship, they're told, parents are told, or the other parent is told, well, go to court and get a court order for this. But during the pandemic, if the courts are closed, it means that it gives an automatic example or advantage to the what I call the most litigious parent, the one who's obstructing the access of the other parent. And
Yes.
if the government is closing down the courts and not acting on this, then that parent who is causing the difficulty, the unfriendly parent, it provides them with an advantage and encourages problems and conflict and disputes and withholding children. So these things are not neutral.
No, they're definitely not. And again, this is where I feel the police, they're getting bad information and bad direction, and their hands are tied. Now, we certainly don't need them to go in and start removing children from one parent to another, but when these situations arise repeatedly and they continue to do nothing, they need to have the ability to do something so that this process doesn't continue and further escalate. I believe that they need to be able, if a part, there's a court order in place. One party is withholding the children, give them a fine. They can still walk away, but they didn't walk away doing nothing. And then other people will have to go and explain their actions to the court instead of just seeing if the other party makes an application to the court, which they probably won't because they don't have the money to pay for a lawyer. And this process just continues repeatedly for years.
Yes, well, you're certainly right, Bill. There are alternatives to the existing system, particularly in Canada. I know in certain cities in the US, and it's much more a local jurisdiction, there are some areas of the US where if there is access denial, then their first reaction is that the police are mandated. It's not something have a choice and say, well, this is purely a civil matter, that it's the violation of a court order. Therefore, the police go to the location, and typically what happens is that they will give them a what is it? A fine without a fine. In other words, it's simply a notice, the fact that they have violated this court order, and stating that they will be fined if they do it again. So restore the access, and a lot of cases that fixes the problem. Now, if they do it a second time, there is actually a cash fine associated with that. So this doesn't require going to the courts. It's something not that the police have any choice in doing it. They're required to do it as part of their duties. So there are ways that these things can be resolved, even if things are shut down, the courts are shut down for COVID or the pandemic. Now, I think you're also right that the problem is the direction that police are getting. The police are getting instructions from the politicians and the services boards that are run by politicians that are directing these things. So the police are having mandates that say, first of all, that okay, if the access is denied to the what they think of as the non-custodial parent, and that translates in the reality saying that if a father is denied access, even if he has a joint custody arrangement, that the police think, well, this is purely a civil matter, so they don't do anything. Whereas if the child access is denied and it's the mother, then there's a real problem that this suddenly becomes a parental kidnapping. And of course, the police do intervene. So there's a bias problem. There is a direction from and that has been made distinctly worse during the pandemic,
All right.
by police inaction.
Yes. Now, one of the Facebook users just commented, police need to be trained to read a court order and uphold it. And I think they are trained and they know how to do that. Again, it comes down to the direction they're being given, and they're being told not to move forward or create any documentation and refer this matter back to family court.
Right. Now, I should mention to people that the idea of this citizens inquiry, and this is an opportunity for parents from coast to coast, because they're going to be having this in a number of provinces. It's not just going to happen in Red Deer, Alberta. So if we can get this going, and admittedly it's a major project,
Mm-hmm.
and if Preston Manning, and he's got a nonprofit that's doing this, then it'll be an opportunity for parents to go in there and say, okay, I was denied access and I called the police and they said they couldn't do anything about it, violation of the court order because during the pandemic, the courts are closed. So we don't have to tell everybody the solution is that police need more training.
Mm-hmm.
We go in there and we say, look, this is what my experience is. It disrupted my life. It disadvantaged my child. I couldn't get access to my child so I can do parenting. The court orders are essentially ignored by the fact that the government shut down the courts. So this is how it affected me. It's how it affected my child. I'm a teacher. I couldn't teach my child during the time that the courts or the government had shut down a lot of the activities. So my child is behind 2 years. So it's a chance for parents to go in there and say, this is how government shutting down lots of things during this shutdown in the pandemic. This is how it affected me.
Okay. So, yeah, do you think that would be good for this inquiry? Would it be beneficial for, like recognition of these situations and the parents that are suffering from these types of incidents? Because it's a problem. I think you've been dealing with this problem for years, and I know I've been dealing with it for a number of years myself, and I haven't had any resolution in my situation. In fact, I'm in court 3 days next week to try and deal with issues prior to going to trial. And it's been 7 years and still haven't had a trial on any issues yet. So they've basically been able to delay getting to court, making a decision on these matters for 7 years in my case, right, which has caused a great amount of damage to me and my family and everyone else that's involved in our lives. It's very damaging. Do you think this inquiry would help maybe get recognition of this pattern that's going on across Canada right now?
Yes, recognition, yes. It's not something that will directly change laws, but it's a real opportunity for parents to get heard. Mm-hmm. And that's the real problem. A lot of cases is that 7 years and it's all procedural and yes, you don't get heard. It's not like you can go into court and say, here's my problems. I'm looking for this to solve it. It's a matter that, they're just going to not listen. Generally, they don't listen to parents. And this is something that is a chronic complaint. It's bad enough when the courts were open, but that they weren't listening to parents. So here's a forum where parents can go in and say, here's the problems, and I believe they were caused by government making it worse during the pandemic. It was bad before, now they've made it much, much worse, and here's the effects on my life. Now, that sort of pressure, public pressure, is what we're trying to build so that we can get the momentum to make change in the law and the practice so that no fit parent loses their child to this government-run family court system.
Okay. And what are some of the problems to having this, like the situation of parental alienation, high conflict divorce, intimate partner violence? What's the difficulties in having these situations recognized by the courts?
Well, the difficulty is that the system is built up as an adversarial legal system with a lot of what I call vested interests, hangers-on, people who are making their living from it. It's not just lawyers, but judges have a vested interest in more of these cases going to court. Now, we've proposed, and I hear I'm getting into the solutions, but the idea is that there are places in the world, jurisdictions, where they have to have quite a different approach, and it's basically a conflict resolution approach. And we use conflict resolution in labor disputes. We use conflict resolution in international border disputes. These are standard approaches to conflict resolution. And you can apply the same thing to family law. Now, the idea is that, first of all, if you base it on conflict resolution, where you get the parties together and you give them, you have mediation as opposed to each hiring the lawyer and costing them large amounts of money. So it's a lower cost, it's a lower conflict, it's directed towards conflict resolution rather than the adversarial legal system is based on a winner and a loser. And that's what it drives towards.
Now,
So we want to change the whole system.
I agree that there needs to be some communication to resolve these issues. The problem is when you are dealing with a person that has a personality disorder, such as narcissistic or borderline personality disorder, they have one mode of dealing with everything, and that's scorched earth. It's their way or no other way, and they don't care who they damage or who they harm or what harm they cause, as long as they get their way, and they're going to throw a tantrum until they get their way, and that's all they know.
Right. Well, the worst place for somebody with that kind of personality disorder is really a courtroom where they can be the center of attention and perform. If you get these people, and we're dealing with a range of things. You get people who start off, being reasonable, but the system encourages that kind of adversarial extremes and performing and acting and being the center of attention. So the system actually does not deal with that kind of, in a very often case, it's kind of low-level mental illness that, you put people under stress, you put them in the center of it. That's not where people are at their best. But if it's in private with a mediator who calms people down, who brings people back where the rewards are to reward people for being reasonable, rather than the rewards for the person who is the most dramatic and most, unreasonable.
Yeah, I agree. That's very logical, Glenn. And the problem I have is that I've been waiting 7 years for my day in court so that the truth can be recognized. And almost every decision and every judge and every outcome and every person throughout the system has been against me, written reports against me, and no one has taken down the information that I've tried to provide. So I know what it's like to be on the other end of this abuse and being subjected to it. So it's not that easy to overcome. I'm still fighting to overcome that after 7 years.
Right. Well, certainly, these are the problems, is that the system is largely focused on procedures.
Yes.
Filling out forms, this kind of gotcha, which is based on the idea that you put in affidavits and people put in the most wild and extreme, provocative affidavits.
Yes.
And then, of course, anything that is not, you don't say, well, that's not true. I challenge that. You don't specifically challenge and dispute every single point on there. Everything you don't challenge is presumed to be true. Now, if you wanted to set up a system that would be the most provocative, then that's exactly how you would set it up. The more you get, it's much more difficult for people to say these things face to face than it is to put it down in writing or get the lawyer to write it down. I think the other thing that is I think important is the fact that there aren't any consequences for lawyers writing down the most provocative accusations, that they don't have to prove. Now, if a lawyer writes something down, I'm very sympathetic to the idea that, if a lawyer writes something down that he knows to be untrue or should reasonably know that he has no evidence for and it's not true, then it seems to me that that lawyer should be facing some sort of fine or charge, or perhaps even up to the level of a criminal offense, because this is the type of thing that damages relationships, makes problems more difficult to solve. And in my kind of Freakonomics mind looking at it, I kind of suspect that that's exactly why the system works exactly that way.
Yes.
To provoke people so that they drag out the conflict until people run out of money. Now, it seems to me that a system that does that impoverishes parents is a system that impoverishes children.
It does.
So we're dealing with a system that is, and I hate to use these words, but to me, I just keep coming back to that. The system is profoundly evil. And so getting back to the inquiry,
yes, that's
it is an opportunity for people to stand up and say, this is what the system did to me. And if you think it's evil, then I wouldn't. Preston Manning has absolutely no problem with calling something evil. And
that's great.
And he's very supportive. So the opportunity is there. So in the sense that parents to go in there and say, here's what the government did to me in the pandemic shutdown. Now, it's a good chance to say the problem with the system is, of course, it was all shut down, like the schools and the courts, and there was no consultation with parents. So with the family law courts being shut down, it was just entirely done by, well, we're a bunch of lawyers and judges and politicians. We decide to do it. We don't need to listen to parents because they're not important. We don't even think in terms of, the judges will continue to be paid, the politicians will be continue to be paid. We'll shut all of this down, but they don't seem to, if their actions show they don't care that parents are losing their incomes, that parents are, not losing access to their children, their parenting time with their children. So we're trying also to get politicians and the judges and the legal system to recognize parents as stakeholders in these events so they don't do it without working with us.
Okay. All right. Well, we've got a question right here that from Benjamin Agvanti. He says, thanks, Glenn, for all your efforts in promoting shared parenting. What are the prospects of equal shared parenting in Canada?
Well, good question, Ben. I really appreciate the question. Now, I'm going to be frank that at the federal level, it is particularly difficult because these are political changes that we're trying to make. And the politics at the federal level is highly adversarial. And they're not allowing much room for our issues. However, on the bright side, I think there is potential at the provincial levels in Canada for change. The provincial levels are a little less adversarial, but it's also that the provinces are often looking for solutions because the provinces bear most of the costs of the existing dysfunctional system. So that equal shared parenting, which is what we're looking for, would actually reduce a lot of the social policing, court costs, administrative costs, welfare costs that are primarily borne by the provinces. So I'm hopeful on the provincial level, and I have to be frank that federally, it's extremely difficult right now.
All right. And thank you for answering that question for Ben there, Glenn. Now, you were talking about having parents as stakeholders in these situations, and could you elaborate on that? Talk a little bit more. And has the CEPC been advocating to have parents as stakeholders in these situations?
Yes, the CEPC, which is the Canadian Equal Parenting Council, has been advocating for a recognition of parents as stakeholders at the federal and provincial levels for quite a length of time. It means that in areas of policy that affects parents, which is family law, which is the administration of justice, closing of the courts, just like in the provincial levels, in schools, there is a recognition of parents through parent councils. So we're looking for a similar recognition by government that policies that affect parents, they should be including parents as stakeholders.
I agree. That would be, I think that would be the smartest way to approach this, is to have them part, instead of having terms dictated to them, like you have them part of the resolution process. And that's how you get these situations resolved. I think it makes sense, but maybe that's just me.
Well, it's more than you. I think if you talk to just about any ordinary citizen in Canada, particularly parents, and you say, we're working so that there is recognition that parents are stakeholders when it comes down to policies that affect them.
Yes.
And they say that makes so much sense. But of course, in talking with politicians, the idea is that, for example, looking at the federal level, if you look at family law and justice issues, those issues are handled by the Department of Justice. Now, there's lots more the implications to, for example, it's a public health issue, and it's also a question of, it's a children's issue, and all of these areas. But in fact, it's viewed entirely as exclusively a justice issue run by the Department of Justice. And they have a formal consultation policy that includes only two groups. And those two groups are lawyers and the feminist women's groups.
Wow.
Now, we're trying to get essentially what amounts to the same status. And the resistance is, as you might imagine, Bill, pretty fierce.
So you're telling me that the Canadian government, Department of Justice, right now, when they make policies, they're only consulting with lawyers and feminist groups.
Right.
That's insane.
Right. Well, I mean, the implications of this are pretty extensive. Now, for example, if you look into the whole question of the Canada Child Benefit, the Auditor General said, look, looking into this thing here, the Auditor General said, look, this doesn't make sense. The fact that it's reserved for the female parent or any female in the home, this should be changed in a modern society. You will run into trouble doing this. And Canada Revenue said, well, this is an issue that was set up by the Department of Finance in conjunction with, Justice Canada. It's a justice legal issue. And of course, they send it back to there saying, we're not doing anything about this to change this. And so we were looking for, to consult with the, Canada Revenue and Department of Finance and Department of Justice, but none of those will actually talk to us about what the Auditor General said. So it's a very foolish thing that they're doing by doing things that, people will say, well, that's discriminatory, and it certainly is. So it makes life difficult for parents, because parents should be able to work out their own arrangements, and it should be the court orders. If court order says they're both equal, then they both should equally be eligible for the Canada Child Benefit.
Yes,
The
I agree.
benefits for the child. So if, why not include both parents? Why put this arbitrary idea that, well, the father doesn't get it because he has his mother in the home, and she gets it because she's female, even though she may not be doing any of the parenting,
Well,
or his sister's in the home, or his second wife. In any female in the home takes precedence over a natural parent. Even that female in the home takes precedence over the court order, which the idea that Canada Revenue, agencies, the government says we don't recognize court orders, it gets, more and more bizarre as soon as you try to make these changes. They have this idea that, well, we're doing all this wonderful stuff on there. It's just that we don't, on these issues, we don't consult with anybody except for lawyers that we're, give special treatment to. And second of all, these other ideological groups that we're funding. So that's the argument, essentially. It's incoherent argument saying this is why parents are not recognized as stakeholders.
well, that what you're saying makes the statistics of children being raised in single parent households makes a lot more sense now after you've explained that. Because currently in Canada, if a child is in a single parent household, 86% of the time it's with a single mother, and about 5 to 6% of the time it's with a single father, and the rest of the cases are varied. So that's a huge discrepancy between women and men having shared equal custody of children. And I, I don't even know how this disparage. This is a huge number. This is like 85%, 86 to 5 or 6%. So there is a huge imbalance of power in these situations, which is what also leads to the high conflict in these situations. You give a person power and control, and if they're not unscrupulous, they will abuse that power and control for their benefit, which causes lifelong damage to the children by this process. And it's not being recognized, and I don't think anyone's representing men. I think this would be an excellent place to start, having men fill out and take this, add to this inquiry to try and find out why that is the case. How come men aren't being represented in these matters?
Well, certainly the question of making changes, and I think this is another impact of the pandemic shutdown, is that it has become enormously more difficult for us to, in fact, to meet with politicians, to lobby them on our issues. And part of that is the increasingly adversarial nature of politics, particularly at the federal level. However, I think the problem that we're dealing with is the fact that if you're trying to make these changes, and whether mothers have as much difficulty as fathers, the system exploits both them for the benefit of the vested interest, which is the lawyers, the typically social workers, all of these people. It creates dependency, and it creates large amounts of illness. And I think we're seeing the kind of mental illness come out in children after the pandemic. And a lot of that is the fact that they are being isolated from parents, and they're not getting their regular activities at school. So if you do these kinds of shutdowns, there is enormous mental illness effect on children, and I suspect on parents as well.
Yes.
So, but that's not being looked into.
I agree. Now I've met with there's one suicidologist in the province of New Brunswick. His name is Gregory Zed, and he's the only licensed clinical suicidologist in the province. And after having a seminar with him, he was speaking about the suicide rates and how traditionally men have higher suicide rates than women, but uh, statistically speaking, the rates of suicide in children had remained static since they began keeping track of these statistics until the last 10 to 20 years, where they've noticed an increase of 2 to 3 times the number of child suicide attempts or deaths in the last 10 to 20 years. And no one can really explain why that is. And I believe it is in part due to the process of alienation, which is basically turning a child and isolating them from the love and affection of one parent. And like you said, COVID has increased that ability to create that break or splitting in those relationships, which is impeding the children from developing normally and developing normal attachment bonds and connections because they're being taught to hate. I really believe this is a large part of the high rise in suicide rates in children.
Right. Well, Bill, you're absolutely right. And in fact, the scary thing about this, and I think this is, I usually try to keep things fairly positive. So
Yeah.
certainly, I would direct people to again this inquiry, supporting it, and it gives a chance for us to voice our concerns and say, you know, there's major problems that are coming out of this that are not being dealt with. But the fact is that if we look into the past, what governments have done, and I'm uh, pointing people to the native residential schools, where what happened there was government stepped in and took kids away from, in those cases, most often it was both parents, and taught them that, you know, to essentially hate their culture. Now, there was a lot of Indian children suicide, native suicide that came out of that. So we know the effects of government um, uh, actions in these cases, where they certainly hired a bunch what were thought of as professionals to teach at these residential schools, but in taking them away from their culture, their communities, their parents, I think it's happening on a much larger scale now in the number of children in the family courts. And it also was happening during the pandemic. So as a result of that, we know the native residential schools produced a lot of disturbed children, a lot of self-destructive behavior, increased rates of suicide, a lot of negative social outcomes. And I think we're looking at the same sort of thing out of the government's mismanagement of the family courts and mismanagement of the shutdown during the pandemic. Now, I'm looking for working with the government to fix these problems, to present solutions. So it's not like I'm trying to bash the government over what they did.
Yes.
I'm willing to cut them some slack and say, okay, maybe they didn't understand what they're doing after
Right.
doing the native residential schools and doing it in family courts and doing it again in the pandemic. Well, you know, we need to be telling them, which of course gets back to the this inquiry
Yes.
on the shutdown, that gives us an opportunity to do exactly that and tell them where they went wrong and suggest that maybe if they work with us, we'd be willing to work with them to find a solution.
You're right. And if you make a mistake, that's how you learn. They've already found something that does not work, and you're right. They need to do something different. And to try and end on a good note here, do you have any successful stories of collaborations or any kind of situations like this that have been beneficial to resolving issues?
Yes, there is a particularly interesting one that I've been trying to get government to recognize, and they say it's a success. And I think, as far as I can tell, I think it is. Now, the government had actually had a real problem in the 60s scoop, and the fact that they were taking children away and they were underfunding the services for Indian children, particularly Native children, on reservations. And so they got a big court judgment against them. And knowing this was coming, they actually, the federal, and we're talking about the federal government. So as much as I bash the federal government, I give them credit on this, and it's a pleasure to do so. The fact that they saw this problem and they took it away from Indian Affairs and they created a new ministry and they collaborated. The new ministry collaborated with Native parents and Native communities and Native organizations to create a system that essentially reversed the old approach and said, unless instead of the government sort of funding organizations and putting the incentives incorrectly, they said, look, what we will do is first prioritize keeping children with their parents and their communities. We're talking about Native
Hmm.
First Nations children, with their communities, with their culture, with their language, wherever possible, and mandating these organizations to work with the government, and the government side would be responsible for providing funding to, and the onus is on government to ensure that that happened. Now, to me, that sounds very much like equal shared parenting. So, and the government, the federal government, we're talking about the Justin Trudeau Liberal federal government, says this is such a success. It was actually picked up, and they're working with the government of Saskatchewan on the provincial level to do the same thing to Native children under provincial jurisdiction in Saskatchewan. So to me, that reads like a success. What we're looking for is to apply this same successful model of collaboration in working with parents and producing kind of the onus is on government to keep children with their parents and their community and their culture. And that's basically how you do it wherever possible. So that reverses the situation in family court. So if that's such a good idea, and we think it is, then we
Okay, yeah.
want the same thing for all children across Canada.
I agree. I agree. There's a definite breakdown of the families. Divorce rates are higher, as high as they've ever been, 50% roughly. Every so there's a whole generation of children that prior to the 70s, the only people that could get divorced were men, and the only way they get a divorce was through the church. Since it became legislated through the government, the divorces, the numbers have increased to the point where they are today, and it's caused the breakdown of the family unit, and children are growing up in these dysfunctional families thinking this is the normal pattern of family, and this is becoming a generational problem.
Right. Well, certainly. What in going? You're referring to the original Divorce Act, which was implemented by Pierre Trudeau when he was Justice Minister,
Mm.
and it's rather interesting to look at that whole approach. Now, what was promised at that time was no fault divorce, and I have yet to find a parent who went through a divorce in court and figured that it was actually a no fault system,
Yes.
because it's moved over from a what was called a fault system into the idea of a winner and a loser. So you have moving it towards a custodial parent, the winner, and a non-custodial parent, the loser. So this to me is the same type of fault-based system that the legal groups have morphed what was called a no-fault system into essentially a win-lose situation. So it's that's the problem. Is the legal system still thinks in terms of its adversarial. If you're adversarial, need a winner and a loser. So
Yes.
we're trying to change it towards the idea that it is a conflict resolution. The idea is not decide for the courts to decide which is the better parent. The idea is the better parent, the best parent is both parents.
Right.
And the job should be just as the job is in the native communities, is to keep the children with their parents and their communities. The same thing in family court should be that the courts and the associated agencies and the lawyers should be mandated to keep the children with the parents unless it meets a certain reasonable standard. You have to show that a parent or both parents are actually a danger to the children, or they're incapable of parenting. And to me, if you look at what parents have done, even parents with low skills end up there. If you look at the outcome of those children, they actually do quite well, even with the most uneducated parents, as comparison to if you put people in a foster home with government employees raising children. Even the most uneducated parents, untrained, do a very good job.
I agree. Professionals say even when the two parents don't get along, if they can adopt a parallel parenting approach, that it is still better for the children because they still have contact with both parents, and it's more cohesive for their life and for them to adjust to the separation and the way new life is going to be now since the divorce. Um, it's traumatic to adults, and I can't even imagine how traumatic it is for children to be going through this and being forced to take sides and dealing with adult issues that they're not qualified to understand or really make decisions on. And it's terrible that sometimes children are placed in that position.
Right. Well, certainly, Bill, you're absolutely right that you don't want to have children making those decisions. However, I would mention that part of the problem is this concept. I think from the courts, the courts are very obsessive about the idea of not allowing any sort of divergent legal rules or opinions. We've got one set of rules, and everybody has to follow the previous judgments. But that's not how parents work. If you look at how children think, okay, well, I have one set of rules at dad's house and one set of rules at mom's house. I don't have a problem with that. In fact, one of Canada's really interesting prime ministers, Louis Saint Laurent, said, look, I was 6 years old before I realized I thought everybody spoke one language to their father and another language to their mother. And we don't have a problem with two languages in this country. We have translation and this sort of thing. And if children go to school as children do, there's one set of rules at the school and another set of rules at home. Children don't have a problem with that.
No.
If you go over to grandma's house, well, grandma has a set of rules there. Back home, the rules are different. That's fine. Kids don't have any problem with that. But the courts think in terms of you have to have, a rigid set of rules that applies all the time. Of course, they only apply that in the cases of a separation and divorce, right?
Yeah.
Which there's a lot of that kind of I guess it's a coercive and controlling type of thinking. And
Yes.
that is largely the basis behind a lot of the parental alienation problems that we see. So
Okay, Glenn,
that is the tolerance for, two different parenting styles, equal parenting, both parents being equal,
I agree. Both parents, as long as the children aren't being abused or suffering from any kind of abuse throughout the situation, both parents should be in their children's lives because they're part of the children, and
Exactly.
the children
The
recognize
children think that their parents are part of them.
that's
So
that's
if you taking one parent and making them unequal, then clearly you are disrespecting that parent. And the children look at that and said, Well, if they don't respect my dad, for example, then I don't, they're not respecting me. I can't respect that part of me. So that's where the negative outcomes come for children.
Yes, it creates confusion and conflict that they're not capable to resolve at their age.
Yes. Well, that's not the type of, you don't want by putting negative inferences on somebody's culture. Let's face it, we all come from a mother and a father,
Mm.
and we have our, our parents have differing cultures. Female culture is different from male culture, and individual culture differ in culture, and you got different languages and different cultural backgrounds. And teaching children to respect both of those backgrounds or a variety of backgrounds is to me the essential part of raising children.
Yes.
The respect for that culture, it teaches children to respect that part of themselves too.
All right. Well, Glenn, we're running in about almost 56 minutes here. Thank you for coming on tonight and
It's been
talking
my
about
pleasure.
this. What was that website again to take part in the inquiry?
I believe it's National Inquiry .ca. If you just simply do a search for
Yep.
National Citizens Inquiry,
And that's what
inquiry
it
with an
is.
I, then
NationalCitizensinquiry.ca.
yes, there you go.
All right. Again, thank you, Glenn, for coming on, and thanks for sharing that information. I'm going to definitely have to take part in that survey and share some of my thoughts. I had no idea that the Department of Justice was only taking information on their policies from lawyers and feminists.
Well, that's their formal consultation policy.
And
Now, they will take input, but it's kind of a case where you send it in a big black hole. I always imagine that, they have this big dumpster that they're filing it into.
a lot of my work is there. I think I know where that one is. I do it for New Brunswick anyway. So,
Exactly.
well, again, thank you, Glenn.
Thank you for
It's
doing
a
this,
pleasure
Bill.
talking with you.
Okay.
Have
Take
a
care.
good night.
All right, good night.